Senator Leyonhjelm.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to Senator Cormann as the Minister representing the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. When introducing the budget on the 12th of May 2015, the former Treasurer, Mr Hockey, said there will be no new taxes on superannuation under this government. A year later, the Prime Minister says the government must live within its means, and yet you have announced new taxes on superannuation. This is obviously to cover up your inability to live within your means. So now you have developed a taste for other people's superannuation. Will you admit that you may dip into these funds again, or can you commit that the superannuation taxation changes announced in the budget will be the only changes this parliamentary term?
The Minister for Finance representing the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services, Senator Cormann.
Thank you very much, Mr President, and I thank Senator Leyonhjelm for that question. Firstly, the coalition going into the 2013 election did make a commitment not to make any unexpected adverse changes to superannuation in our first term, and we delivered on that commitment. The honourable thing to do is to flag the intention to pursue reforms prior to an election, and that is of course what we did in the 16-17 budget. And none of these changes have yet been legislated. We announced them as part of the budget just before the election. We took them to an election. They are reforms designed to make the superannuation tax concessions framework fairer and more sustainable and fit for purpose. We've put them in front of the Australian people, seeking their endorsement, seeking their mandate. We were successful at the election, and as such, not only do we have a mandate to implement the reforms that we took to the last election, we have a responsibility to the Australian people to deliver on what we said we would deliver. Now, we also said before the election that we would conduct a process of consultation in relation to the implementation arrangements in relation to these reforms. That is a process that the Treasurer, together with the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services, has been conducting over the past few months, and as soon as that process has come to a conclusion, relevant announcements on next steps and timings in terms of the introduction of legislation will be made.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Leyonhjelm, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. You will index the 1.6 million cap on pension phase superannuation by the CPI and the age pension by the higher of CPI and wages growth. This will lift the number of age pension recipients compared to Australians in self-funded tax-free retirement and narrow the gap between the pension and the income of self-funded retirees. Minister, why are you promoting dependence over independence in this way?
Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Mr President. I don't accept the characterisation that that is what the government is doing. I just want to remind everyone that as a result of our reforms, the proposal is for earnings from capital up to $1.6 million, and that is right, indexed, that cap is indexed. Earnings from capital on the back of $1.6 million worth of savings will be completely tax-free, completely tax-free. And earnings on capital above $1.6 million would attract the still concessional tax of 15%. Now, the structural problem that we've got in Australia is that when you've got a growing proportion of income generated in Australia completely tax-free, 0% income tax, it means that every other Australian, it means that every working Australian has to pay more tax than they otherwise would have to in order to fund the necessary services of government. And that is why we're pursuing the reforms that we're pursuing.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Leyonhjelm, final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Minister, some of your superannuation measures impose a tax rate of 30%, for example, contributions in excess of $25,000. Can you confirm that the government considers a 30% rate of tax on superannuation savings to still be concessional? And can you indicate what rate of taxation of superannuation tax would not be considered concessional?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr President. A 30% rate of tax on certain contributions into superannuation has been in place for some time. It's not something that has first been considered by this government, and I suspect that the Senate, well, in fact, I know that the Senate will have the opportunity of arguing and debating and exploring all these issues in great detail when the legislation on this reform package comes before the Senate.
Thank you, Minister.